Welcome. I'm Terry Kramer, Faculty Director of the Easton Technology Management Center at UCLA Anderson, and I'd like to welcome you to this special webinar on technology innovation opportunities in an era of COVID-19. And this is part of the broader UCLA Anderson Forecast event at the intersection of our economy and technology. Now, obviously, we live in a world today with huge opportunities and huge challenges. And many of those opportunities and challenges have been heightened in an environment of COVID-19. And in many cases, technology is playing a critical role in dealing with these challenges and opportunities, whether in areas like telehealth, e-commerce capabilities, video conferencing, et cetera. But we're also seeing an environment where many enterprises, often established enterprises, don't have the technology capabilities to effectively deal with the current environment. We also have a series of leadership issues assessing what may be a new normal, looking at areas of how we shop, where we're educated, where we buy, that are fundamentally changing in nature, that are creating opportunities for technology-based innovation, but also creating challenges for many companies. So a fundamental set of questions comes from all this that really is going to lead into our session today is, where are these innovation opportunities? How will they be helped or hurt by COVID-19? I can't think of a better speaker for this than Scott Brady. Scott Brady is one of the managing partners at Innovation Endeavors. I've known him for quite a few years. Innovation Endeavors was a venture fund originally established by Eric Schmidt, now that has a lot of other investors in it, and has a great track record with investments in companies such as SoFi, Uber, and Plenty. Also, Scott has got his own network besides his portfolio companies. He's got his own network of investors and entrepreneurs. It gives him a real bird's eye view about where innovation opportunities exist. If all of that isn't impressive enough regarding Scott's background, he's a lecturer in management at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. In terms of the format, I'm going to ask Scott a series of questions. We'll then go to audience Q&A. And then we'll do a wrap at the very end of that. So Scott, let me just start out a big welcome. It is great to have you here with us.
Thank you, Terry. It's a huge honor to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. And Scott, let me start at the very highest level, like I like to in a lot of these webinars. If you could give us just your own broad view of tech today, as you look at your portfolio companies and you look at the whole landscape that's out there, what are you seeing in terms of key investment themes, opportunities, as well as challenges?
Yeah, so I would say, and I'll preface this by saying that the work that we do at Innovation Endeavors tends to be very technical. So the lens that I'll talk about is primarily through the lens of technology and innovation. So the key themes that we're seeing are consistent with what we've been focused on over the last 10 years. The rise of the global pandemic, along with localized issues like the California wildfires, have demonstrated the need to devote more attention to the significant challenges that will be facing humanity over the next 50 years. So in order to do this, we need to find ways to accelerate the innovation cycle. And despite the globalization and I would say the rapid innovation cycle that's been occurring in digital technology companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, we haven't really seen the same pace of innovation in non-digital industries like healthcare, infrastructure, agriculture, supply chain. So the key themes that we're focused on in Innovation Endeavors are at the intersection of computer science and traditional industries. We're focused on what will be possible in the near future, not just what's possible today. And then we invest to accelerate the pace of technology change in order to allow humanity to tackle some of the world's hardest problems. This rapid change is brought about, from our perspective, by three key areas. The first is the proliferation of data. Through the digitization of the physical world, we now have access to data that allows us to describe the world in ever-increasing levels of granularity, whether it be from advancements in things like genomic sequencing, high-resolution sensors, transaction data. It's now increasingly cost-effective to store everything, which gives us a longitudinal view of the world. The next important component is ubiquitous computing. Through the growth of both cloud and powerful edge-based computing, we now have the ability to ingest the world's data in real time and leverage technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning to allow us to make decisions better, faster, cheaper than ever before. And then the final piece, which I think is one of the critical pieces, is around things like robotics and automation. This enables substantially higher throughput for experimentation, unlocking knowledge about the physical world that simply would not have been attainable using a traditional hypothesis-driven research approach. Now, as we run more experiments, the cycles get faster. It allows us to understand complex patterns, which scales our ability to come up with new insights, make really radical improvements. And as a result, product cycles that used to be prohibitively expensive now only cost a fraction of previous efforts. And instead of taking years, development cycles can now be completed in weeks or months. So what's interesting about this is this dynamic, these capabilities are turning industries upside down. This is what's allowed startups to advance more cheaply and at a much faster rate than incumbents. The learning velocity will continue to accelerate, resulting in really agile companies that are delivering better, faster, more cost-effective solutions. And I think over the next 10 years, I believe there'll be multiple iconic companies that are going to be created because of this technology intersection.
Excellent. Scott, let me drill down now on COVID-19, because you've talked about these interesting three areas: ubiquitous computing, robotics, genomics, et cetera. And if you look at COVID-19 right now, has that changed your investment thesis short term? Are there certain areas you're wanting to double down on and other areas you want to avoid in the next year or two?
Yeah, and I'll answer the question. I'll give you a bunch of examples because I think that's a helpful way to look at it. So in many ways, I think COVID has been a time machine. It's forced industries and governments to move forward 10 years into the future in order to respond to the rapidly changing environment that we all find ourselves in. So generally, we've seen a positive impact from COVID on our portfolio. But maybe the best way to do this is by way of example. So I'm going to talk around a couple of different key industry segments, and I think it'll give you an idea of the breadth of things that we're seeing. So first off is using data and resources. So we're now seeing cities and governments using data to make life or death decisions on behalf of their constituents. One of our portfolio companies, Replica, has really been at the forefront of this trend. So Replica was a company that I helped to spin out of Google Sidewalk Labs in 2019. It was co-founded by a computer science professor at UC Berkeley, and they developed advanced urban planning tools to analyze the movement of people and goods within a city. What's really creative about their approach is rather than directly sampling actual location data, which would violate everybody's privacy, Replica creates a completely synthetic view of movements using thousands of unique personas that allow us to understand how people and goods are moving through a city. So these tools are the difference between cities and governments flying blind and having state-of-the-art tools to positively impact lives. And to give you an idea, in areas like in the state of New York, they will literally light up a data center for an extended period of time to crunch that data so that we can make it available almost in real time to the people that need to make these decisions. Mm-hmm. So another area that we've seen significantly impacted by COVID has been around, you mentioned online commerce and local delivery. I think this has put a tremendous strain on the existing supply chain and forced companies to innovate quickly to survive and ultimately thrive in what appears to be a new normal. So we've seen incredible demand for automation and robotics to augment labor and increase productivity through things like shared autonomy. In our portfolio, we're seeing a number of companies that have benefited from this trend. One of the interesting ones is Fabric. So Fabric is a relatively large, late-stage robotics and automation company that's developed an automated micro-fulfillment and distribution center. So this allows grocery stores and commerce companies to build smaller, highly distributed fulfillment centers that are closer to customers. If you think about the traditional model of having a massive distribution center that's located on the outside of a city, there's no way it can meet the expectations of customers that are looking for faster, cheaper, ultimately more intimate experiences that get products to them more quickly. So what's interesting is a company like Fabric can make any grocer as efficient as Amazon. And I'll walk through a few more just to be helpful. Another team, which is one of my student teams out of Stanford, is a company called Afresh. So it's a professor who's now at Cornell that's developed a revolutionary AI platform for grocery stores around ordering, forecasting, and operations. So an environment like COVID, you can imagine where demand is moving rapidly. The best grocery stores that were able to leverage advanced machine learning technologies like Afresh we're able to respond more quickly to demand shocks and meet the customer demand, all while reducing food waste and improving margins at the store level. Another one on the supply chain, which is interesting, is a company called Gatik, which is a team out of Carnegie Mellon that's currently partnered with Walmart to provide autonomous short-haul logistics between their stores and their distribution centers. So the simple model of having a big warehouse and then communicating to stores, now we're seeing a mesh network that's getting created where everything has to be connected to everything else. So as demand for online grocery exploded, Gatik service enables an entirely new model of supply chain for retailers to be able to efficiently and autonomously provide fulfillment of bringing goods back and forth across these systems. And then maybe just a few more, just by way of example. One of the most recent investments I made is a company called Third Wave Automation. This is a team out of Google Robotics that's developing a shared autonomy solution for forklifts. So interestingly enough, to automate the movement of goods within large warehouses. So they're attacking one of the most dangerous jobs in supply chain, driving or working near a forklift. And their solution allows a single operator to control multiple forklifts simultaneously, all while improving productivity and safety. So if we step out of sort of the industrial side, we start thinking about things like life sciences, which is another area we spend a lot of time on. We've seen tremendous progress using data science and robotics to accelerate the development of therapeutics, vaccines, and other things that will greatly improve the lives of everyone on a global basis. It's an industry that's historically taken decades to bring new products to market. However, with COVID, we're now focused on, for example, bringing vaccines to market in a matter of months rather than years. So a couple of interesting ones there in our life science portfolio. One is Color Genomics, which has been a leader in genomics platform testing. They were able to quickly offer a self-swab test that allows unsupervised COVID testing, allowing privacy and expanding availability of tests for folks like universities, employers, and hospitals. Then additionally, we've got a long list of companies like ICON, which is the Nobel Prize winner at Berkeley, DuPont, Vicarious Surgical, all of which are using advanced computation and automation to solve some of the biggest problems in life science, but doing it in a time frame that's, again, measured in weeks or years or months rather than decades.
Mm-hmm. So all of these, Scott, tie into kind of your three views about the availability of data and what it can be used for. That gives you this longitudinal view, the ubiquitous nature of computing, robotics. All of this is kind of tied into that area. Let me ask you, Scott, because implicit in what you're talking about is an investment thesis and a view about what the future looks like. And, one of the things we talk a lot about at UCLA is, what is the new normal? And on one extreme, people say, you know what, you can talk with using all these fancy terms, but things are basically going to revert back in how we go to school and how we shop and where we eat and where we're entertained and all that. It's going to go back basically. Other people are saying, no, it's not going to go back. And we see this with companies that are saying they're never going to go back off of work from home, et cetera. Tell us your view about how do you form your view about the new normal? Because it sounds like, I would assume with the long investment horizon you've got, you're assuming a whole bunch of things in our lives are not going to change from the current COVID mode. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think the bulk of what I've been talking about is how we can create innovation. What are the precursors, capital, talent, and ultimately this preponderance of the three key things that I spoke about. But as it relates to COVID, I think it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure that my opinion is better than necessarily anyone else's. I don't have a crystal ball. However, given the work we do in industry and academia, I do see a couple of interesting trends. I think what I do find interesting is I think COVID has forced employers to do things that they would never have done previously, to be thoughtful about remote work, to experiment, and ultimately trying to figure out how to become open-minded to what the future of their companies, might look like. And I think ultimately we've seen both positives and negatives. Obviously things like eliminating commute in the Bay Area, where it's not uncommon for someone to spend 2 hours commuting. Getting 2 hours back in your day is a huge, huge defining thing. Or the ability to live where you want to live. You've seen companies like Apple and Google and I think Facebook have basically said that at least for the next 12 months, so from this summer, they're going to allow employees to basically be where they want to be. And that was so that they could get childcare, have their kids go to school, and ultimately sign a lease. But I think after that 12 months, we'll begin thinking about what the new normal is really starting to look like. I think the downsides are that it's changed the way we interact interpersonally. And I think it's also removed barriers between personal life and work life. I mean, I hear consistently that people feel like they're working longer now than they did previously. There's very little breaks. So I think if we step back from this, I think there are some companies that are better suited for remote work than others. And obviously we're talking about knowledge-based companies. If you're a software company, and you can look at really stellar examples like GitHub or Stripe, they've effectively leaned into the remote work process, even many cases like GitHub before COVID, and they've been developing processes and structures to organize themselves around this approach. However, in a lot of our work, where we have companies that are, do work in robotics or lab-based in what they do, it's much more difficult to manage a remote workforce, given that you need to interact with the hardware on a daily basis. So the reality is, what is it going to look like, post-COVID? I think it's likely to be not the extreme we were at before or the extreme that we're at today. It's likely to be some type of hybrid. And my sense is that's going to bring about a completely new set of challenges. I don't know at UCLA, Terry, when you were teaching your classes, but I'm at Stanford, I'm very comfortable teaching a class in person. I think I'm becoming comfortable teaching a class remotely. If I had to teach it in a hybrid where I had people in class and not in the class, I think that would bring about a set of challenges that we haven't really taken on. And I think that likely is a bit of a microcosm for some of what companies are going to deal with over the future. So I think it's fascinating. I think the most creative companies that experiment will likely find the best solutions for them, but it won't be a one size fits all.
Yep. Scott, let me press on this a little bit more. And I want to give you a data point here. Zoom, the company a lot of us use for video conferencing. If you look at their current market cap, they're at about 125 billion right now. They've had a 5-fold increase in less than a year. They have more than 150 million active users. And obviously all the things that we learn about efficient markets and how you value companies suggest that a lot of very talented investors believe the long-term growth of Zoom, not short-term, but long-term, based on the multiple that they have, that people are going to be video conferencing in huge amounts long-term. Do you think that sends a message that there is a notable new normal that is going to be much more based on video conferencing and everything that we do?
I mean, I'll preface by what I'm about to say that I'm not a market trader. It's not really where I focus my time. I'm normally looking 3 to 5 years out in the future. That being said, my sense is that the norm that we're in right now will change. And I think if it does begin to hybridize, that means that fewer people will be using what's available today, if you will, as the current technologies for communicating remotely. So I think that the future of what will happen with Zoom, and quite frankly, all of the other companies, is largely incumbent upon what type of innovation they begin to bring for the next wave of this. So for example, better than just the simple video conferencing we're using now, you could see the future leaders in this space really bringing about real innovation, finding ways to build better intimacy, finding ways to allow people to communicate more effectively. So I don't think the status quo is really static here. I think that ultimately this is going to change over time. And if Zoom continues to be innovative, maybe they'll continue to be one of the dominant players, but there's a number of companies that are now beginning to focus in this segment.
Yeah, let me ask you on that again, Scott, and this gets into the issue of who's going to be the net winners. Is it going to be large companies? Is it going to be small ones? Because you mentioned the importance of data and lots of data. So I attended a session maybe a year ago where Eric Yuan, the founder CEO of Zoom, spoke about the company. And one of the questions I asked him is, tell me about innovation opportunities at Zoom. And he said, listen, if we are able to aggregate enough data about video conferences with an opt-in, we're going to be in a position that we can give key takeaways and themes so that people don't all need to attend a video conference. We're going to give them the biggest gain in their lives they could get, which is the savings of time. Does that suggest to you, Scott, that it's going to take bigger companies with access to data, existing relationships to win, and they're going to have a net advantage compared to young ventures here?
Yeah, I think that that's a fairly simplistic way of looking at it. If that was the case, then we'd all be buying from Sears and Roebuck and not Amazon. So you have a combination of the three things I talked about, data being one of the preeminent ones. That is critical. But the reality is innovation requires companies to really begin to think beyond the products that they have today or beyond what's possible today. So, I don't believe that that necessarily the incumbents are the only ones that can win. In fact, for example, when I hear Eric talk about this with portfolio companies, we don't think the enemy is actually the bigger companies. I think the biggest enemy is actually time. And I think this is true for both large companies and small companies. They need to find ways to innovate in an increasingly faster pace. And then they need to find ways to achieve scale with these new approaches that they're creating. So I think in the current environment, companies that are not, I think in today, companies are not typically constrained by capital. Talent is going to be the catalyzing ingredient and the ability to take risk. So, I think that ultimately it doesn't matter whether you're big or small. It matters how quickly you can mobilize around the next set of innovations and reduce friction around scaling to execute on that vision.
Mm-hmm. Good. How do you think about, when you mention, you kind of say you need to think about the next wave of products? How do you do that? Is it mostly you get exposed to a lot of very talented entrepreneurs and they come to you with ideas, or you have your own kind of view about what those next wave of products should look like?
No, I mean, we're investors. We're not entrepreneurs, at least not anymore. The reality is we meet the market where it is. And I think where we have been successful is we're trying to find people that have a unique view of the future, either based on fundamental work that they've done. So many times someone has created a new technology that allows something to be done, maybe not even today, but to be done in the near future that will be 10x or 100x better than what's possible today. And the interesting thing is, if you think about traditional venture investing, there are kind of three modes that we invest across. One is technical feasibility. So can something actually work? Two is around product market fit, which is I think what the majority of venture capital does, where someone has a hypothesis about the future and you give them capital to go test that hypothesis. And then the third one is, if you get the first two, is around execution and scaling. That's where you normally see growth capital. In our world, we focus primarily on technical feasibility. So if somebody can do something, for example, in any one of the companies I mentioned previously, if you can do something 100 times better than it's done today, we actually don't worry about product market fit. What we worry about is mobilizing a team around that capability to try and make the technology work, where it might have worked in a lab, but we need to make it work in real life. So where we tend to do a good job is to intersect at that fundamental point where something may be possible in the near future, and then give the company the capital so they can access the talent to try and execute on that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Good. Scott, let me ask you about some of the products and services that are technology based today, to get your view, and also to ask, are these things that you would invest in, or these are kind of already mature technologies? So if you look at areas like telehealth, it's being talked about now much more than it ever was before. E-commerce solutions, video conferencing. If we hear about a lot of those today, streaming solutions in media. Are you keen on those, or that's already stuff that investors from a few years ago were working on, and you're working on stuff that's 10 years out from there?
I wouldn't say we're working on things that are necessarily 10 years out, but I think what we tend to look at is, what are the enabling technologies that make these new generations of solutions possible? So, I know one of the areas that you and I have spent a lot of time on is the growth of telecommunications, and 5G in particular. And you look at the impact that it might have on industry, and I think it's really fascinating. And I think, what we've seen is advanced telecom, things like bigger pipes, data, compute, have all historically unlocked new use cases. And I actually think 5G will be a catalyst for a lot of capabilities that really haven't been possible previously, just given the bandwidth constraints that we've had. So if you think about it on the consumer-facing side, you're going to have things like telehealth, things that you've mentioned, which I think are in its infancy today, but will continue to get increasingly more sophisticated. For example, we have a team out of MIT that's developing advanced microsurgical robots that maybe can be controlled directly when you're in front of the patient or even potentially remotely. I think you're going to see advancements in things like entertainment, ways that people find productive time where they can enjoy themselves. And then I think on the infrastructure side, you're going to see these types of increased bandwidth supporting things like autonomous vehicles and advanced computer vision and things that will allow us to make decisions faster. But what I think is really interesting is if you look at the growth of high capacity, particularly around 5G, we've reached the point, and we actually reached the point probably a number of years ago, where we've effectively delivered 100% coverage for where people live. We're now trying to find a way to give them a higher, better, quality of service than what they have right now. What I find interesting is, today, if you focus on where people live, that represents maybe 20% of the planet. The question is, what do you do for the other 80% of the planet where we don't have good coverage, where we have very limited ability to communicate? I think if you look at innovation that will spur, first order innovation that will spur second order opportunities, look at things like what Elon Musk is doing with Starlink. This is an opportunity using a broadband, basically a large constellation of LEO-based satellites to deliver broadband connectivity on a global basis. So that's really something that takes what we have with cellular and really democratizes it across the earth. Or if you look at a company, Terry, that you and I are familiar with, a company like Skylo, which is a company that came out of the Space Systems Lab at Stanford, they're actually solving a very different problem than what Elon is solving. They're solving on how do you deliver global connectivity for machines, so narrowband connectivity using geostationary satellites to deliver a new type of communication that's never been possible before. To be able to allow millions or billions of sensors to communicate anywhere on the globe cost effectively. And it's interesting as we sit in California looking at things like the fires that have devastated so many lives and so many communities and cost, I can't even guess now what the number is. It's certainly in the tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars. The reality is today, sitting in 2020, we still rely upon people to see the smoke from a fire. And California is so vast, and there's so many remote areas that we have fires that start, become large, and then just rage across the state. Imagine with a technology for a company like Skylo, what if we could deploy millions of sensors everywhere around California, everywhere around the US, let's say, so that we can remotely monitor what's going on throughout the state. Imagine that the second a fire starts, we have a sensor that alerts to a satellite network and tells us, so we can dispatch maybe an airborne firefighting crew that can put it out before it even starts. It is shocking to me today that we're still so analog how we think about these problems, but we're on the cusp of entirely new capabilities being created. This is an example of a use case for a technology. It's not actually the technology. There will be thousands of use cases like this that get created, and those are the companies that are going to become the interesting companies in the future. They're going to take advantage of something that wasn't possible previously to do something that we couldn't do previously. And that's where I think you're going to see the most interesting innovations happen.
Yep. Scott, now let me ask you here, we've been talking a lot about kind of the pluses, all the things that are new innovations that are going to do well, et cetera. What businesses, industries, offerings are on your worry list that you say, you know what, this industry is going to be going through some real downturns, or maybe it's a young venture? What are the areas you think are not really good right now?
Well, maybe even stepping back just a little bit from that, if we look at what's been the impact, I think broadly across probably large companies and small companies from COVID, is how do you conduct business? And I think what's happened is a lot of the people who consume these products or technologies, what they found is that because of COVID, many times their internal buying processes have slowed down. So they're taking longer to buy technology. I think what's also happening is because of the limited amount of time they have and their need to focus on what's important for them, they've now become much more sophisticated in how they prioritize what are the few things they can do. So I think if you're a large company or a small company, it is incumbent upon you to figure out how to describe your solution in a way that you can get to that top 1, 2, or 3 that a company is going to need to ultimately do. And if you can't get on that list, I think you have a big, big problem. Now, we at Innovation Endeavors, we don't focus a lot on consumer technologies, but I think the industry is just littered with industries now that are suffering greatly. If you think about travel, if you think about all the traditional bricks and mortar businesses that are out there that have effectively had their business models turned upside down. I'm really happy. I'm not happy for those industries, but I'm happy that it's not an industry that we're actively involved in, because I think it's going to be very difficult over the coming year, and then maybe even multiple years after this.
Yeah, are there certain sectors you'd say are going to have a disproportionate amount of disruption? So, you look at retail as an example, and people aren't shopping in stores as much. Healthcare now, with companies like Google and Amazon eyeing healthcare, are there certain areas that you'd say industries be on the lookout, have your radar or your IoT devices especially finely tuned because you got some tough things coming? Are there certain sectors like that you worry about?
I would say, worry about means we don't spend any time on it. So what I would say is, what are we focused on? I think that maybe the analog of that is what makes it maybe a little more interesting. So I would say what we're excited about, the areas that as a firm that we're spending a lot of resources on, are the future of infrastructure, the future of industrial industries, the future of life sciences, the future of food and ag. How are we going to feed the world by 2050 is something that occupies a lot of our time. I think the future of cyber in an increasingly online world. I think the future of supply chain, the future of advanced compute. How do you more cost effectively support all this? These are the areas where we're probably spending the majority of our time on. It doesn't mean this is a comprehensive list. We can't do everything, but these are the areas when we think about the intersection of computer science and these more traditional industries. These are the things that are going to stand to gain the most from some of the innovations that are going to happen over the next couple of years.
Good, good. Let me now shift, Scott, to the economy, because obviously this is part of the UCLA Anderson forecast event, and they do some terrific work kind of looking about where's the economy going, what sectors are good, big focus on California, but abroad. So first of all, when you look at where investment's going to happen, where innovation's going to happen, where jobs are going to get created on a geographic basis, what is your view? Are things still going to stay heavily concentrated on the coasts, where we already see big technology centers in San Francisco and Boston, et cetera? Is it going to be more evenly spread? We recently saw announcements that TikTok's US operations may be in Texas. What is your view about kind of geographic spread of economic growth?
Again, I'm not an economist, so I'll give you my opinion, but it's not worth that much. But I would say that to the question of, do we see economic growth occurring differently geographically? I would think the answer is kind of a yes and a no. So let me dive in. I think first, we are seeing distributed teams. We're seeing the spreading of economic growth. Like, for example, in California, we've seen a number of people move to Colorado, for example, to try and get a higher quality of life. And there's no doubt that having that talent in Colorado will be impactful for that state. But the reality is, for the same reasons I think it's been difficult to replicate the Silicon Valley and other parts of the world, I think we're going to continue to see geographic centers of innovation. There's still going to be concentration, and there's going to be some nexus of companies, investors, talent that are all going to come together. But I do think that we will see some hybridization of teams, and I think largely that will create smaller pockets of talent that I think are generally going to spread some of the economic growth more democratically or more on a greater geographic distribution than has probably happened historically.
Yeah, and where are the areas you'd say keep your eye out on? Are there certain other parts of the country that historically have not experienced a lot of technology-based innovation growth that now will?
I don't think the geographies are going to change that radically. If you look at, a lot of our work tends to align with what's happening academically. So you look at the centers of excellence in academia, you're still going to see substantial work coming out of the Northeast. If you look at, some of the life sciences work happening at Harvard right now, I think that's pretty remarkable. You look at some of the innovation work happening at MIT. If you look at what Professor Ajay Shah is doing up at University of Toronto, I think that's extraordinary. I think Israel continues to be a powerhouse for innovation. We're seeing more out of Texas. And then I think the Silicon Valley is quick to adapt as well. So you're seeing many of the traditional pockets begin to innovate, I would say, more quickly. So it'll be interesting to see whether it democratizes beyond that. You are seeing, just given the growth of technology, you're seeing other parts of the world begin to wake up. I think you're seeing India start to wake up. You're seeing Asia, which represents probably, more than half of the world's population. You're seeing that entire region begin to wake up to the opportunity around technology. I think Eric, if you look at Eric's recent comments, I think he believes strongly we need to find ways to cooperate and compete coopetition with some of these regions as opposed to outright opposition.
Yeah, and do you think on the US-China relations that actually there'll be more net growth in the US now that supply chains are getting reconfigured and there's kind of a standoff and different standards in each country, that this is going to create net growth for the US? Or no, this is kind of closing down markets that has a disproportionate effect?
I mean, I think there are some industries that are going to be profoundly impacted. If you think about, for example, the supply chain related to silicon for ASICs, chips, and so forth. We rely upon a global supply chain now that's taken us 25 years to be able to create. I don't think it's possible just to snap your fingers and suddenly have that be changed overnight. I do think that from a political perspective, we have to decide what are the things as a country that we have to have unique proprietary access to and not rely upon global supply chain. I actually think the global silicon market is going to be one of the markets that we will likely need to focus on, and that we're talking probably $1 trillion in a 25-year process to repatriate all of those skills back into the US. And we have to make sure that we're not just propping up businesses because they're domestic. We have to make sure that we continue to be globally competitive in terms of what we do. And I think that remains a pretty significant challenge.
Yeah. And Scott, also related to economic growth, many of the ventures you talked about that are involved in robotics that kind of mitigate the need for labor. Will that have, years from now, a negative effect on demand for labor, the future of work, in essence, that will create its own economic challenges? You'll have growth of ventures, growth of technology exporters, but you'll have labor impact because of things that are getting automated.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is best described by way of examples, because I think at 50,000 feet, it's easy to lose the plot in terms of what's actually happening here. So I'll give you two companies I think are relevant to talk about. The first one is a company I've been working with for quite a while. It's called Canvas. It's a team out of MIT that was funded by DARPA, looking at robotics in semi-structured environments. So the robot that they've created actually works in the construction industry. It helps with the finishing of drywall. And what was interesting about that particular process, it's a process that historically has been done by humans. It's a process that dates back thousands of years. I mean, if you go back to plaster. And what's interesting is if you look at the union today, that supports drywall, in fact, there aren't a lot of people that are waking up that are young and saying, hey, I want to do drywall. It's a dirty, difficult, very physical job that you have to do. So in fact, the average age in that union was actually increasing. So when this company was thinking about solving this problem, they did something very creative. They actually went to the union and partnered with them to try and create a new type of job that people would actually want to do. So what they've been able to do is to create a job class that pays much more money, that doesn't have the same physical aspects to it as somebody that's just manually doing the work. And it's something that's bringing in a new type of person into the union that is excited about doing this, that actually plays to a lot of the skills that they want to have and represents a career that I think that they can really enjoy. So I think some of the best innovation is innovation that happens together with industry. And another one that's interesting is plenty. One of the biggest challenges we face over the next 50 years is we need to increase our food supply by 70% to feed the earth. You think about the growth in population, reductions in arable land and potable water, and at the same time, we're looking at agriculture to scale, but nobody wants to do that job. So you've got companies like Plenty that are bringing automation and robotics to try and greatly accelerate the efficiency of these industries so that we can, in fact, feed the world, but not cause the price of food to increase dramatically. We want to be able to democratize good food for everybody in the world. So I
Yeah.
think if we're really going to solve the problems that exist over the next 50 years, we're going to have to find creative ways to create the types of jobs that people want to do. And I think automation and robotics can be a great method of doing that if we think about it in a shared autonomy mode.
Yeah. Scott, also related to that, underserved communities. Your view on a lot of the technology-based innovation, will these be a net help in serving underserved communities, whether it be in the end solutions, whether it be in employment opportunities, et cetera? Or, you know what, we need to watch out here because these things can actually further kind of increase the divide that has existed and plagued the U.S.?
Yeah, I think generally I'm an optimist, but there's some aspects of this that I find very concerning. I think COVID in particular has had a disproportionate impact on segments of the population that were least capable of dealing with it, both in terms of jobs, childcare, access to quality education. I mean, I can see it in my own family. I have college-age kids that have really struggled with what has transpired and how they're having to learn now, whether they're prepared to do it and are in a fortunate situation where they have access to broadband and their own computers where they can actually do it. And I think the other aspect of this that we haven't really talked about is the psychology of it. I mean, we've become increasingly lonely. I mean, I see my kids being removed from their social groups that they normally have to support them, and they're having to identify new methods of being supported. So if I take that and I sort of parlay that out, the reality is we have a lot of work to do here to make sure that the core infrastructure is available, that we have broadband for everyone, we have good devices. We don't have one laptop for a house. We have the right compute devices for everybody that's in the house that needs to get access to education. I think there are some bright spots. I think we're learning how to teach remotely now, certainly at the university level and at the local level. And I think that can be a democratizing agent as well. So hopefully there's some bright spots around this. So I'm hopeful that with the right policy investments, we can potentially reduce the digital divide. However, it's going to require tremendous focus, support, I think investment from both the government and the private sector.
Excellent. Good. Scott, let me ask you a couple of questions from the audience here. So first one is drilling down on the US-China situation. How does the decoupling of the technology industry between US and China affect your view on investment opportunities? So number one, would you invest in companies that are based in China? The opposite side is for the companies that are in the US, have you kind of proportionally reduced the size of market because of what is a divide today between the US and China?
I think the reality is the answer is it's too early to tell. I think for us, we tend to be alongside the investments that we make. So they tend to be geographically in proximity to us and our network. So we don't currently do a lot of work in China, but we do see a lot of innovation that's coming out of there. And we see within our portfolio a tremendous diversity of people that are founding these companies, people from all over the world. I think the US has historically been really a catalyst for bringing together the best talent in the world from places like China and India and Israel and all of these other innovative places. And I think the thing that I'm most concerned about is, whether the regulatory or the political environment ultimately makes it difficult for the US to gain access to that talent. I think that that's a huge mistake for us as a country. We need to find ways to welcome the best people in the world, find ways to make sure that they're being good actors, but ultimately allow us to participate with them in creating the next generation of innovation.
Mm-hmm. Good. Another question, former student of mine, Mike Catania, he asked, what specific data points do entrepreneurs need to show you pre-revenue to help create the trend line that convinces you of a 10 to 100x improvement over the existing technology?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say there's a general boilerplate that we use, but the reality is it's very situational depending upon the group that we're looking at. I think generally speaking, we're looking for world-class teams. So if multiple people have the same idea, is this the team that could likely win? I think we're looking at the addressable market. Like if this were to work, is this an opportunity worthy of the entrepreneur's time? Is it an opportunity worthy of our time? And then I think the third dimension is, do we think we can help with more than just money? Can we use our network? Can we use our experience? Can we help them with talent? what are the things that we can do to help them? So I think if those three things for us are positive, then I think largely it's something we would be excited to consider.
Good. Let me ask one other question, and I want to do a wrap up here. How do you protect your IP, ideas, innovations, especially for startups and small businesses? Is it becoming more difficult to compete with big companies? And again, this is the earlier question. There's interesting work that Kareem Lakhani and Marco Inciti at HBS have done on competing in an era of AI that talks about kind of these virtuous cycles of data, algorithms, and all companies need to kind of be organized around that. Do you worry about it? I know you've kind of intimated that that's kind of a different world, but do you see risks for young companies here in protecting themselves?
This is something I deal with a lot at Stanford. It's the question of people that are working on an opportunity and it's so secret and so private they can't share with anybody. My experience is that if the business you're working on is so fragile that the process of sharing it causes it not to work, then you have a much bigger problem. The reality is that the real value of creating something new and innovative is really around execution. So unless there's some fundamental patent around a technology where you've invented a new material, the reality is that small companies, in many cases, have an advantage over large companies in that they can create processes from scratch that allow them to take profound risks and innovate. They're not stuck supporting just their existing customers. So if you ask me, would I take a highly talented startup with a new idea to go do really well in the market versus an incumbent that's going to try and do an innovative process within their existing structure? I'll take the new company any day. And that's really, I think, endemic of how the Silicon Valley and the world of innovation has actually worked.
Yep, excellent. Scott, let me now summarize what I took away from our time together here, and then I want to give you an opportunity either to upgrade what I've said or share any parting thoughts that you've got. So I've got 5 or 6 big points that I took away. First one is fundamentally about leadership and what is a changing environment with COVID. Your first point is that COVID-19 has forced lots and lots of companies to kind of relook what they're doing, what they're offering, the customer experience, et cetera. And implicitly, you're saying proceed, at your own caution here. Do not disregard a changing environment. A second point you made, which is also on this issue about leadership, is think beyond the products and services of today. So implicit in what you're saying is we all tend to kind of have our, whatever it is, 0 to 2 year framework of what we look at. You're saying, look out 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, try and have a longer term framework. A third point I took away is when you're looking at innovation from an application standpoint, make sure you're starting with the enabling technologies. Do the enabling technologies exist? Are they being deployed? Are they widely available? 5G was an example of that. Another point I got for all the entrepreneurs listening here is this issue about look at technical feasibility first, then look at product market fit, and then look at execution and scale. That those are kind of 3 key requirements of any successful venture. And your latter point, by the way, was the execution thing. You better be good at that. If you think it's just come up with the idea, improve product market fit, and that's it, you've missed some big opportunity. And then a couple of last points here. Cross-industry disruption. Implicit in what you're saying is there are going to be a lot of industries getting disrupted. New ways of developing offerings that are lower cost, more effective. You talked about plenty in agriculture. You've talked about some things in retail, et cetera. Watch out for cross-boundary disruption. People from outside the industry coming into your industry. And then the final points that I got is, on the economy, you're not wringing your hands that the California economy is in for tough times. There may be a little bit of rebalancing across the country, but there's so much value in the new things being created that will create a benefit. And what we do need to focus on, though, is the democratizing technologies to make sure that we've got technology that broadens access, whether that be low-cost broadband connectivity, whether it become new forms of online education, that we make sure that piece is covered. and that requires fundamentally a partnership between business and government. Those are the main messages I got. Upgrades on those or any parting comments?
I think that that's a great summary. Just a couple of comments I would make just from my background as an entrepreneur. I think the most interesting companies are created at the most difficult times, mostly because it requires, sort of visionary technologists or visionary leaders to really make a leap of faith to do something and solve a problem that, exists in the future. And, it's a time when noise in the system goes down. There are fewer people trying to do innovative things because the market is scary. I think if you have a good enough opportunity, there's capital that's available. So I think largely what I tell my students is that, entering into a bad market is an opportunity to do something extraordinary. And I think if you look back at disruptions that happened in 87, 2000, 98 or 2008, I think consistently you'll see new generations of companies that have been created that have really become iconic and have changed the world. So I would encourage people to be brave when other people are timid. When people are running out of the burning building, don't be afraid to run in. That's where the most interesting things happen. And then just to maybe hammer home the point that you made is that I think if you're really doing something innovative, you have to have a hypothesis about the future. You have to solve a problem that likely doesn't exist today, but will exist in the future. And that requires more prescience. It's not the simple first order process of, wow, this hurts today, I'm going to solve this problem. Likely everybody else is thinking about the same problem. So thinking about some of the, not just the first order, the second order things that are going to be opportunities in the future, and making sure that when you start to execute, you intersect with it maybe 2 years in the future when that opportunity is really significant. And I think the best entrepreneurs have that ability to, anticipate what's going to happen and then mobilize the resources, both capital and talent, to go solve that problem.
Scott, outstanding advice. And let me just extend a big thank you, because it's interesting. You always give us really interesting insights about technology, about innovation, but you also give us leadership insights, which span the test of time, about how you look at where innovation is going to happen, about today. Don't get discouraged in a COVID-19 world, because some of the greatest things will come, and keep that North Star. So Scott, a huge thank you for spending time with us once again. I hope we can have you back again very, very soon. Thanks to everybody joining us today, and thanks for our colleagues at the UCLA Anderson forecast. Take care.
Thanks, Terry. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.